In the grand halls of palaces across Europe, where portraits of noble ancestors line gilded walls and crystal chandeliers cast their light on centuries of royal history, there exist stories that were never meant to be told. Stories of children born into the highest echelons of society, yet condemned to live in shadows. Stories of princes and princesses whose only crime was being born different in an age when difference was seen as shame. For centuries, royal families have been presented to the world as paragons of perfection, their bloodlines pure, their heritage unblemished. But what happened when a child was born who didn't fit this carefully crafted image? What became of the royal children born with Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities in an era when such conditions were misunderstood, feared, and hidden away? Today, we journey into the forgotten chapters of royal history, where palaces became prisons, where family members became strangers, and where love was often sacrificed on the altar of reputation. This is not just a story about royalty, it's a story about humanity, about how we treat our most vulnerable, and about the long road toward understanding and acceptance. The story begins in the early 20th century, when medical understanding of intellectual disabilities was primitive at best. Down syndrome, first described by British physician John Langdon Down in 1866, was often referred to by offensive terms that reflected the deep misunderstanding of the time. Families, even royal ones, were given little guidance beyond the recommendation to put the child away for the good of all involved. In the sprawling estates of the British aristocracy, this advice was often followed without question. The Bowes-Lyon family, into which the future Queen Mother would marry, held secrets that would remain buried for decades. Deep within the family tree were two cousins, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, born in 1919 and 1926 respectively, both with severe intellectual disabilities. Nerissa and Catherine were the daughters of John Herbert Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother's older brother. From birth, it was clear that both girls were different. In an era when families of lesser means might struggle to care for a disabled child, the Bowes-Lyon family had resources, but they also had reputation to consider. The decision made by the family would haunt them for generations. In 1941, when Nerissa was 22 and Catherine was 15, they were quietly committed to the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Surrey, a Victorian institution for people with mental disabilities. The hospital, despite its royal patronage, was far from the luxury one might expect for members of such a prominent family. The girls were placed in a ward with other forgotten souls, their royal connections meaning little in the harsh reality of institutional life. What makes this story particularly tragic is not just the abandonment, but the deliberate deception that followed. In Burke's Peerage, the official record of British nobility, both Nerissa and Catherine were listed as having died in 1940, the year before they were actually institutionalized. To the world, and indeed to most of their own family, these two women simply ceased to exist. But they were very much alive. For decades, Nerissa and Catherine lived in the hospital, forgotten by their family, ignored by history. They had no visitors, no acknowledgement of their birthdays, no recognition of their royal heritage. They were three forgotten women in a sea of forgotten souls, their only companions other patients, who, like them, had been deemed too inconvenient for society to bear. The staff at Royal Earlswood knew who they were, of course. Hospital records clearly identified them as members of the Bowes-Lyon family. Yet this knowledge brought them no special treatment, no comfort, no connection to the world they had been born into. They lived as paupers in an institution that bore the name royal, but showed them none of the dignity that title implied. Catherine, the younger sister, lived until 2014, spending 73 years in various institutions. She outlived almost everyone who had made the decision to hide her away, yet she never experienced freedom, never knew family love, never understood why she had been abandoned. Her life was a testament to an era when shame trumped compassion, when image mattered more than humanity. The story of the Bowes-Lyon cousins might seem like an isolated tragedy, but it reflects a broader pattern among European royalty. Across the continent, similar decisions were being made in other noble families, though few were documented with the same detail that would eventually bring the Bowes-Lyon story to light. In Germany, the Prussian royal family faced their own challenges with disabled children. Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, born in 1915, was the daughter of Crown Prince Wilhelm and Crown Princess Sully. From an early age, it was apparent that Alexandrine had significant intellectual disability. Unlike the Beausoleil cousins, Alexandrine's condition was not entirely hidden. It couldn't be, given her position in the line of succession, but her life was severely restricted. Alexandrine lived a sheltered existence, kept away from public view and formal royal duties. While she was not institutionalized like her British counterparts, she was effectively erased from public memory. Royal photographers learned to arrange family portraits so that her absence wouldn't be noticed. Official biographies of the Prussian royal family barely mentioned her existence. The princess lived until 1980, reaching the age of 63, but her life was one of isolation within the gilded cage of royal residences. She had caretakers, but not friends. She had shelter, but not freedom. She had the title of princess, but none of the agency that should come with royal birth. These stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society, even at its most privileged levels, treated people with intellectual disabilities. The royal families, with all their resources and influence, chose concealment over care, reputation over relationship. But they were not alone in these choices. They were simply reflecting the attitudes of their time, magnified by the pressure of public scrutiny. The medical understanding of Down syndrome in the early to mid-20th century was woefully inadequate. Doctors often told families that children with the condition would never develop beyond a mental age of 3 or 4, would never learn to read or write, and would be a burden for life. These grim prognoses, while completely inaccurate, shaped the decisions of countless families, royal and common alike. In institutions like Royal Earlswood, the treatment of patients reflected these misunderstandings. People with Down syndrome were often grouped together with individuals who had severe mental illnesses or profound intellectual disabilities, regardless of their actual capability. The assumption was that all mental defectives, as they were cruelly termed, were essentially the same and required only basic custodial care. The daily life in these institutions was regimented and dehumanized. Patients woke at set times, ate prescribed meals, and followed strict schedules that left little room for individual preference or personal growth. Educational opportunities were virtually non-existent. After all, why educate someone who was believed to be incapable of learning? For the royal children hidden in these places, the contrast with their birth circumstances must have been profound, though they likely had little understanding of what they had lost. They were born into families with unlimited resources, yet they lived lives of profound deprivation. They were entitled to the finest education, yet they received none. They should have been surrounded by love and attention, yet they lived and died in obscurity. The psychological impact of institutionalization on people with Down syndrome was severe, though little understood at the time. The lack of family contact, the absence of meaningful activities, and the general atmosphere of hopelessness took its toll. Many individuals who might have thrived in a more supportive environment deteriorated under the conditions of institutional care. But even as these tragic stories unfolded in the shadows of royal life, seeds of change were being planted elsewhere. In the mid-20th century, a few pioneers began to challenge the prevailing wisdom about intellectual disability. Parents who refused to institutionalize their children started forming support groups. Researchers began to study Down syndrome more carefully, discovering that earlier assumptions about the condition were largely wrong. These early advocates faced enormous social pressure. Families who chose to keep their disabled children at home were often criticized for being selfish, for refusing to face reality, for burdening society with their choices. The medical establishment largely opposed them, and social services often tried to pressure them to reconsider. Yet these brave families persisted, and slowly, attitudes began to change. By the 1960s, research was beginning to show that people with Down syndrome could learn far more than previously believed. They could develop meaningful relationships, contribute to their communities, and live fulfilling lives when given appropriate support and opportunities. The contrast with the royal children hidden away in institutions could not have been starker. While some families were fighting for their children's rights to education, inclusion, and dignity, The most privileged families in society were continuing to hide their disabled members away, pretending they had never existed. This paradox highlights one of the most troubling aspects of the royal disability stories. These families had the resources to provide excellent care, to hire the best specialists, to create supportive environments. Instead, they chose the path of least resistance socially, prioritizing their public image over their family members' well-being. The secrecy surrounding these cases also meant that opportunities for positive change were lost. Had the royal families been open about their disabled members, had they used their platforms to advocate for better understanding and treatment, the lives of countless other families might have been improved. Instead, their silence perpetuated the shame and stigma that kept people with disabilities hidden away. The discovery of the Bose-Leon story in 1987 sent shockwaves through British society. When a journalist uncovered the truth about Nerissa and Catherine, still alive after decades of being listed as dead, it forced a national conversation about how people with disabilities had been treated. The royal family's initial response was telling. They claimed no knowledge of the situation, despite clear evidence to the contrary. This revelation came at a time when attitudes toward people with Down syndrome were rapidly evolving. The 1980s saw the beginning of the inclusion movement in education, the development of community-based services, and a growing understanding that people with intellectual disabilities deserved the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. The contrast between the progressive movements of the 1980s and the Victorian attitudes still being practiced by one of Britain's most prominent families was jarring. Here were two women who had spent their entire adult lives in institutions, not because they needed to be there, but because their family found their existence inconvenient. The media attention surrounding the Bose-Leon revelation was intense, but brief. The royal family's discomfort with the story was palpable, and efforts were made to minimize its impact. Official spokespeople emphasized that the decision had been made by extended family members, not the direct royal line, and that different attitudes prevailed in earlier eras. Yet the damage to the royal family's reputation was significant among disability advocates and families affected by Down syndrome. Here was clear evidence that even in the modern era, the most privileged families in society had been willing to abandon their disabled members rather than face the challenges and rewards of including them in family life. The story also raised questions about other royal family members with disabilities who might have been hidden away. While the Bose-Leon case was the most well-documented, researchers began to uncover hints of other similar situations in royal families across Europe. The culture of secrecy around disability in royal circles made it difficult to verify these stories, but the pattern seemed clear. In France, the de Gaulle family faced their own challenges with disability, though they handled it very differently. General Charles de Gaulle and his wife Yvonne had a daughter, Anne, born in 1928, with Down syndrome. Unlike their royal counterparts across the Channel, the de Gaulle made the remarkable decision to keep Anne at home and include her in their family life. Anne de Gaulle's story provides a stark contrast to the British royal experience. While the Bose-Leon cousins were hidden away and forgotten, Anne was loved, cherished, and included in her family's life, to the greatest extent possible given the limitations of the era. The de Gaulle's decision was not easy. It meant giving up certain social opportunities and facing criticism from those who believed they were being selfish. Charles de Gaulle, who would later become president of France, spoke openly about his love for Anne and how she had changed his perspective on life. He once said that Anne had taught him more about humanity than all his years in politics and military service. This acceptance and love created a warm, supportive environment where Anne could develop to her fullest potential. Anne lived until 1948, reaching the age of 20. Her death was a devastating blow to her parents, who had invested themselves completely in her care and development. Unlike the royal children who died in institutions, surrounded by strangers, Anne died at home, surrounded by family members who loved her deeply. The de Gaulle family's approach to Anne's disability was revolutionary for its time. They refused to be ashamed of her condition, refused to hide her away, and instead chose to adapt their lives to include her fully. This decision required enormous courage, as they faced constant social pressure to institutionalize her. Their choice paid dividends not just for Anne, but for the entire family. The de Gaulle children grew up understanding disability as a natural part of human variation, rather than something to be feared or hidden. This early exposure to disability created a family culture of acceptance and inclusion that lasted for generations. The contrast between the de Gaulle and royal approaches to disability highlights the role that individual choice plays in shaping outcomes for people with disability. Both families had similar resources and social positions, yet their different choices led to vastly different outcomes for their disabled family members. This difference also illustrates how cultural attitudes toward disability varied across different societies. While British aristocracy seemed particularly concerned with maintaining appearances of perfection, French culture, perhaps influenced by different philosophical traditions, was somewhat more accepting of human difference. Yet even the de Gaulle family's progressive approach was limited by the medical and social understanding of their time. Anne received love and acceptance, but she likely didn't receive the educational and therapeutic interventions that we now know can dramatically improve outcomes for people with Down syndrome. The family did their best with the knowledge available, but that knowledge was still severely limited. The evolution of understanding about Down syndrome throughout the 20th century is remarkable. From the early days when people with the condition were considered uneducable and were routinely institutionalized, to the modern era when individuals with Down syndrome graduate from college, hold jobs, live independently, and contribute meaningfully to their communities, the progress has been extraordinary. This progress makes the royal disability stories even more poignant. The children who were hidden away in institutions were born at exactly the wrong time in history, too late to benefit from the ignorance that might have made their abandonment seem less cruel, but too early to benefit from the knowledge that could have given them fulfilling lives. Modern research has shown that people with Down syndrome have far greater potential than was ever imagined in the early 20s. With appropriate support, education, and opportunities, individuals with the condition can develop reading and math skills, form meaningful relationships, work in competitive employment, and live semi-independently or independently. The key factors that determine outcomes for people with Down syndrome are remarkably similar to those that determine outcomes for anyone: family support, quality education, high expectations, and opportunities to contribute meaningfully to their community. The royal children who were institutionalized were denied all of these factors, not because resources weren't available, but because their families chose to prioritize other concerns. This reality makes their stories particularly tragic. These children were not condemned by their disability. They were condemned by the choices made by the people who should have loved and protected them. They had the misfortune to be born into families that valued reputation over relationship, image over individual worth. The institutional settings where these royal children lived were often horrific by modern standards. Royal Earlswood Hospital, despite its grand name and royal patronage, was a typical Victorian institution for people with mental disability. Patients lived in large wards with minimal privacy, followed rigid schedules, and had little individual attention or stimulation. The philosophy behind these institutions was based on the medical model of disability, which viewed people with intellectual disabilities as sick individuals who needed to be cared for rather than as whole people who needed support to reach their potential. This approach led to environments that were more like warehouses than homes, places where people were stored rather than helped to grow and develop. Daily life in these institutions was monotonous and dehumanizing. Patients woke at the same time each day, ate the same foods, followed the same schedules. There were few opportunities for choice, for personal expression, or for meaningful activity. The assumption was that people with intellectual disabilities were incapable of making decisions or contributing meaningfully, so no opportunities were provided for them to prove otherwise. The staff in these institutions, while often well-meaning, were poorly trained and overworked. They had little understanding of the potential of people with Down syndrome or other intellectual disabilities. Their job was seen as purely custodial, to keep patients clean, fed, and safe, but not to help them learn, grow, or develop meaningful relationships. For the royal children in these settings, the experience must have been particularly jarring, though they likely had little understanding of what they were missing. They were born into families where individual attention, luxury, and privilege were taken for granted, yet they lived in environments where basic human dignity was often absent. The medical care in these institutions was also typically poor. People with Down syndrome often have associated health issues, including heart defects, thyroid problems, and increased susceptibility to infections. In institutional settings, these health issues often went undiagnosed or untreated, leading to unnecessary suffering and shortened lifespan. The psychological impact of institutional living was severe. People with Down syndrome, like all humans, need love, attention, and meaningful relationships to thrive. In institutional settings, they were often treated as less than human, their emotional needs ignored, their potential dismissed. This treatment often led to depression, behavioral problems, and failure to develop to their full potential. The contrast between institutional life and family life for people with Down syndrome is dramatic. Research has consistently shown that individuals with the condition who grow up in loving, supportive families develop far better social skills, communication abilities, and independence than those who are institutionalized. The royal children who were hidden away were denied these benefits not by necessity, but by choice. The secrecy surrounding these cases also had broader social implications. When prominent families hide their disabled members away, it sends a message to society that disability is shameful, that people with intellectual disabilities are not worthy of inclusion or acceptance. This message has far-reaching effects on public policy, social attitudes, and the experiences of other families dealing with disability. Had the royal families chosen a different path, had they been open about their disabled members and advocated for better understanding and treatment, they could have used their platforms to create positive change for countless other families. Their silence and secrecy while protecting their own reputations contributed to the stigma and discrimination faced by people with disabilities throughout society. The discovery of these hidden stories in recent decades has forced a reckoning with this history. Families affected by Down syndrome have had to confront the reality that even the most privileged members of society were willing to abandon their disabled relatives rather than face the challenges of inclusion. This knowledge has been both painful and motivating for disability advocates. The response of the royal family to the revelation of the Bowes Lyon story was telling. Rather than acknowledging the tragedy and expressing regret for the treatment of Nerissa and Catherine, official responses emphasized that the decisions were made by extended family members and reflected different attitudes of earlier era. This defensive response suggested that even in the modern era, there was reluctance to fully confront the implications of these choices. Yet the revelation of these stories has also contributed to positive change. They have sparked conversations about how people with disabilities have been treated throughout history, highlighted the importance of family support and inclusion, and demonstrated the tragic consequences of stigma and shame. These stories serve as powerful reminders of how far society has come in its understanding and treatment of people with disabilities. The modern disability rights movement draws strength from these historical injustices. The knowledge that people with Down syndrome were once routinely institutionalized, hidden away, and denied basic human dignity serves as motivation for continued advocacy and progress. These stories remind us that acceptance and inclusion are not inevitable. They must be fought for and protected. Today, people with Down syndrome live vastly different lives than their counterparts in earlier eras. They attend inclusive schools, participate in sports and arts programs, work in competitive employment, live independently or semi-independently, and contribute meaningfully to their community. Some have even become advocates and public speakers, sharing their experiences and perspectives with the world. This progress is the result of decades of advocacy by families, professionals, and people with disabilities themselves. It required challenging deeply held assumptions about intellectual disability, fighting for changes in laws and policies, and slowly shifting social attitudes through education and awareness. The contrast with the royal children who were hidden away could not be more stark. While Nerissa and Catherine Bowes Lyon lived and died in institutions, never experiencing freedom or family love, people with Down syndrome today have opportunities that would have been unimaginable in earlier eras. They can pursue education, careers, relationships, and dreams just like anyone else. Yet challenges remain. People with Down syndrome still face discrimination, limited opportunities, and social barriers. The progress that has been made is significant, but it is not complete. The stories of the royal children remind us of how far we have come, but also of how much work remains to be done. The medical understanding of Down syndrome has also advanced dramatically since the era when royal children were being hidden away. We now know that Down syndrome is caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21, that it occurs in all populations regardless of race or social class, and that it is nobody's fault. This knowledge has helped reduce the shame and stigma associated with the condition. We also now understand that people with Down syndrome have a much wider range of abilities than was once believed. While they may learn more slowly than typical individuals and may need additional support in some areas, they are capable of far more than earlier generations imagined. They can learn to read and write, develop job skills, form meaningful relationships, and live fulfilling lives. Early intervention services, inclusive education, and community-based supports have all contributed to improved outcomes for people with Down syndrome. These services were not available to the royal children who were institutionalized, but they are now standard in many parts of the world. This progress represents the fruits of decades of advocacy and research. The stories of royal children with disabilities also highlight the importance of family acceptance and support. Research consistently shows that the attitudes and expectations of family members are crucial factors in determining outcomes for people with disabilities. When families have high expectations, provide love and support, and advocate for their disabled members, outcomes are dramatically better. The de Gaulle family's treatment of their daughter Anne demonstrates this principle clearly. Their acceptance, love, and inclusion helped Anne develop to her fullest potential within the limitations of her era. In contrast, the abandonment of the Bowes-Line cousins condemned them to lives of deprivation and missed opportunities. These historical examples serve as powerful lessons for modern families dealing with disability. They demonstrate that the choices families make have profound consequences for their disabled members, and that love and acceptance can overcome even the most challenging circumstances. The role of social attitudes in shaping the experiences of people with disabilities cannot be overstated. The royal families who hid their disabled members away were responding to social pressures and expectations of their time. They believed, perhaps correctly, that acknowledging their disabled relatives would damage their social standing and influence. Yet by succumbing to these pressures, they contributed to the perpetuation of attitudes that harmed countless other families. Their silence and secrecy reinforced the message that disability was shameful and that people with intellectual disabilities were not worthy of inclusion or acceptance. Modern disability rights advocates understand that changing social attitudes is crucial to improving the lives of people with disabilities. Laws and policies are important, but they are not sufficient if social attitudes remain unchanged. The hidden stories of royal children with disabilities serve as reminders of how social pressure can lead even privileged families to make tragic choices. The power of individual stories in changing attitudes should not be underestimated. While the hidden royal children were denied the opportunity to share their stories, the discovery of their experiences has had a profound impact on public understanding of disability issues. Their stories serve as powerful examples of the human cost of discrimination and exclusion. Today, people with Down syndrome and their families are much more likely to share their stories publicly, challenging stereotypes and changing attitudes through personal testimony. Social media has provided new platforms for these stories, allowing people with disabilities to speak for themselves rather than having others speak for them. The evolution of language around disability also reflects changing attitudes. The cruel and dehumanizing terms used to describe people with intellectual disabilities in earlier eras have largely been replaced by person-first language that emphasizes the humanity and dignity of individuals with disability. This linguistic evolution is more than just political correctness. It reflects fundamental changes in how society views people with disability. The royal children who were hidden away were victims not just of individual family choices, but of broader social attitudes that viewed them as less than human. Changing language is one way of changing these underlying attitudes. The legal framework surrounding disability rights has also evolved dramatically since the era when royal children were being institutionalized. Laws now mandate that people with disabilities have rights to education, employment, housing, and community inclusion. These legal protections would have made it much more difficult, if not impossible, for families to simply abandon their disabled members to institutional care. Yet legal rights mean little without enforcement and social support. The stories of the royal children remind us that even when resources are available, individual choices and social attitudes can still lead to tragic outcomes for people with disabilities. The economic arguments for inclusion and support have also become clearer over time. Research has shown that investing in education, support services, and community inclusion for people with disabilities produces better outcomes at lower costs than institutional care. The royal families who chose institutionalization were not just making morally questionable choices, they were making economically inefficient ones as well. Modern approaches to supporting people with Down syndrome emphasize person-centered planning, which involves the individual with disabilities in making decisions about their own lives to the greatest extent possible. This approach is the antithesis of the institutional model that warehoused the royal children, making all decisions for them and giving them no voice in their own lives. Self-advocacy has also become an important part of the disability rights movement. People with Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities are increasingly speaking for themselves, sharing their perspectives, and advocating for their rights. This development would have been unimaginable in the era when royal children were being hidden away, but it represents the logical culmination of decades of progress in understanding and respecting people with disabilities. The stories of royal children with disabilities serve as both tragedy and inspiration in the modern disability rights movement. They are tragic reminders of how people with disabilities have been treated throughout history, but they also inspire continued advocacy and progress. They remind us that acceptance and inclusion are not inevitable, they must be continuously fought for and protected. As we reflect on these hidden stories, we must ask ourselves what lessons they hold for our own time. While we have made tremendous progress in understanding and supporting people with disabilities, challenges remain. Discrimination, exclusion, and low expectations still limit the opportunities available to people with Down syndrome and other disabilities. The royal children who were hidden away never had the chance to show the world what people with Down syndrome could achieve. Their potential was squandered not because of their disabilities, but because of the choices made by those who should have loved and supported them. Their stories serve as powerful reminders that every person with a disability deserves the chance to reach their full potential, regardless of their family's social status or the attitudes of their time. In remembering these forgotten children, we honor not just their lives, but the progress that has been made in their name. We commit ourselves to continuing the fight for inclusion, acceptance, and opportunity for all people with disability, and we ensure that their tragic stories will not be forgotten, serving as eternal reminders of the human cost of discrimination and the transformative power of love and acceptance. The legacy of these royal children with disabilities is complete. Their lives were tragic, but their stories have contributed to positive change. They remind us of how far we have come, while also challenging us to continue the work of building a more inclusive and accepting society for all people with disability. The institutional records that survived from places like Royal Earlswood Hospital paint a chilling picture of systematic dehumanization. Patient files reduced human beings to clinical observations and behavioral notes. Nerissa Boseline's file, discovered decades later, contained sparse entries that revealed little about her personality, her preferences, or her inner life. She was described in terms of her limitations, never her strengths or potential. These clinical records stand in stark contrast to what we know about people with Down syndrome today. Modern understanding recognizes that individuals with the condition have rich emotional lives, distinct personalities, and varied interests and abilities. They form deep friendships, experience joy and sadness, and contribute meaningfully to their communities when given the opportunity. The tragedy of the institutional era was not just that people with Down syndrome were hidden away, but that their humanity was systematically denied. They were seen as problems to be managed rather than people to be valued. This dehumanization made it easier for families and society to justify their abandonment and neglect. In the case of the royal children, this dehumanization was particularly stark. These were individuals born into families with unlimited resources, yet they were treated as if they had no value whatsoever. Their royal birth, which should have guaranteed them luxury and privilege, instead became a liability that led to their complete erasure from family history. The psychological impact of this treatment extended far beyond the individuals directly affected. Family members who participated in or witnessed these abandonments often carried guilt and trauma for the rest of their lives. Some family members were never told the truth about their disabled relatives, growing up believing they had died in infancy. When the truth eventually emerged, it shattered family narratives and forced painful reckonings with the past. The Queen Mother Elizabeth Boseline lived until 2002, dying at the age of 1. For most of her long life, she maintained the fiction that her cousins Nerissa and Catherine had died in childhood. When the truth emerged in 1987, she was in her late 80s, and official statements claimed she had no knowledge of their survival or their conditions in the hospital. Yet hospital records suggest otherwise. Some evidence indicates that the royal family was aware of the cousins' survival and their conditions, but chose to maintain the fiction of their death rather than acknowledge their existence. This choice reflected a calculated decision to prioritize reputation over truth, image over humanity. The impact of this revelation on the disability community was profound. Here was concrete evidence that even in the modern era, one of Britain's most prominent families had been willing to abandon and erase their disabled members. It confirmed what many had long suspected, that the attitudes of earlier eras persisted longer than most people wanted to admit. The story also highlighted the vulnerability of people with disabilities in institutional settings. Without family advocacy or public attention, they could simply disappear from history. Their voices were silenced, their stories untold, their very existence denied. This erasure was not accidental, it was systematic and deliberate. The staff at Royal Earlswood Hospital who cared for Nerissa and Catherine over the decades found themselves in an impossible position. They knew these women were members of one of Britain's most prominent families, yet they received no special attention, no visitors, no acknowledgement of their heritage. Some staff members later reported feeling troubled by the abandonment they witnessed, but they were powerless to change the situation. The hospital itself was a relic of Victorian attitudes toward disability. Built in the 1850s, it was designed based on the belief that people with intellectual disabilities needed to be separated from society for their own good and for the protection of others. The architecture reflected this philosophy: high walls, locked doors, and institutional wards that prioritized control over comfort. By the time Nerissa and Catherine arrived at Royal Earlswood in 1941, the hospital was already overcrowded and understaffed. The Second World War had diverted resources away from institutions like this, leaving patients with even less attention and care than usual. For two young women who should have been living lives of privilege, the conditions must have been shocking. The daily routine at the hospital was rigid and unforgiving. Patients woke at dawn, ate meals at prescribed times, and followed schedules that left little room for individual preference or spontaneity. There were few recreational activities, minimal educational opportunities, and no preparation for life outside the institution. The assumption was that patients would remain there for life, so there was no point in developing their capabilities or independence. This institutional philosophy was the antithesis of what we now know helps people with Down syndrome thrive. Modern approaches emphasize choice, independence, community inclusion, and the development of each person's unique potential. The royal children at Royal Earlswood were denied all of these elements, not because they weren't available, but because the institution's philosophy didn't value them. The contrast between the lives these women could have lived and the lives they actually lived is heartbreaking. With their family's resources, they could have had private tutors, specialized therapies, enriching experiences, and loving support. Instead, they lived lives of profound deprivation in an environment that saw them as burdens rather than human beings with inherent worth. The discovery of their story in 1987 came at a crucial time in the disability rights movement. The 1980s saw the beginnings of the deinstitutionalization movement, as advocates and families pushed for community-based alternatives to institutional care. The revelation that members of the royal family had been victims of institutionalization added powerful ammunition to arguments for reform. The timing was also significant because it coincided with growing public awareness of Down syndrome. The 1980s saw the first generation of children with the condition who had benefited from early intervention services and inclusive education beginning to reach adulthood. These young adults were proving that earlier assumptions about the limitations of people with Down syndrome were wrong. The contrast between these successful young adults and the royal children who had been hidden away was stark and powerful. It demonstrated clearly that the difference in outcomes was not due to the severity of the disability, but to the quality of support and opportunities provided. The royal children had been failed not by their condition, but by the choices made by those who should have protected them. This realization sparked important conversations about responsibility and accountability. Who was responsible for the abandonment of Nerissa and Catherine? Was it their parents, who made the initial decision to institutionalize them? The extended family members who perpetuated the lie about their deaths? The medical professionals who recommended institutionalization? The society that made such recommendations seem reasonable? The answer, of course, was all of the above. The tragedy of the royal children was the result of individual choices made within a broader social context that devalued people with disability. It was a systemic failure that implicated not just the families involved, but the entire society that allowed such treatment to continue. The response of the royal family to the revelation was carefully managed, but ultimately inadequate. Official statements expressed regret for the situation, while distancing the direct royal line from responsibility. The message was clear. This was an unfortunate situation involving distant relatives, not a reflection on the current royal family's values or attitude. Yet this response missed the deeper significance of the story. The abandonment of Nerissa and Catherine was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of how society treated people with disability. By minimizing their connection to the story, the royal family lost an opportunity to acknowledge this history and commit to doing better. The disability community's response was more complex. Some advocates were angry about the abandonment and the subsequent cover-up, seeing it as evidence of deep-seated prejudice against people with disabilities. Others focused on using the story as a catalyst for change, using the public attention to highlight the need for better services and support. The story also raised questions about other hidden members of royal families across Europe. If the British royal family had hidden away their disabled relatives, what about other noble families? Research began to uncover hints of similar situations in other countries, though the culture of secrecy around royal disability made it difficult to verify these stories. In Denmark, rumors persisted about members of the royal family who had been quietly institutionalized or hidden away. In Spain, similar whispers surrounded certain branches of the royal family. These stories were difficult to confirm, but they suggested that the British experience was not unique, that royal families across Europe had made similar choices when faced with disabled family members. The pattern seemed to be consistent across different cultures and time periods. When a child was born with obvious disabilities into a royal family, the response was almost always the same: hide the child away, control information about their condition, and minimize the impact on the family's public image. The specific methods varied, but the underlying approach remained remarkably consistent. This consistency suggests that the problem was not limited to particular families or cultures, but reflected broader attitudes toward disability that transcended national boundaries. The pressure to maintain an image of perfection was so strong that even the most privileged families in society were willing to sacrifice their own children to preserve it. The medical professionals who advised these families bear some responsibility for these tragedies. Doctors in the early to mid-20th century routinely advised families to institutionalize their disabled children, often painting extremely grim pictures of what life would be like if they chose to keep their children at home. These medical opinions carried enormous weight, especially with families who had no other source of information about disability. Yet even within the medical community, there were dissenting voices. Some physicians recognized that people with Down syndrome had more potential than was generally acknowledged, and they advocated for more humane treatment. These progressive voices were often marginalized or ignored, but they provided important early challenges to the prevailing orthodoxy. The nursing staff who actually cared for the royal children in institutions found themselves in particularly difficult positions. They were expected to provide care for these patients while maintaining the fiction that they were ordinary residents with no special connection. Some nurses later reported feeling conflicted about this arrangement, knowing that these women had families who could provide much better care but had chosen not to do so. These caregivers often developed genuine affection for their patients, including the royal children. They saw their personalities, their struggles, and their small triumphs in ways that their abandoning families never did. In some cases, these staff members became the closest thing to family that institutionalized individuals ever experienced. The records kept by these caregivers provide some of the only glimpses we have into the personalities and experiences of the royal children who were hidden away. Nursing notes describe Nerissa as gentle and affectionate, someone who enjoyed music and responded positively to kind treatment. Catherine is described as more withdrawn but still capable of forming relationships with staff members who took the time to get to know her. These brief descriptions hint at the rich inner lives that these women possessed, despite being written off by their families as hopeless cases. They suggest that with appropriate support and opportunity, both women might have developed much more fully and lived more fulfilling lives. The tragedy is not just that they were abandoned, but that their potential was never realized. The economic cost of institutionalizing the royal children was also significant, though this was rarely discussed at the time. Institutional care was expensive, especially for individuals who remained in care for decades. The Bowes-Lyon family paid for Nerissa and Catherine's care at Royal Earlswood for over 40 years, a substantial financial commitment that could have supported much higher quality community-based alternatives. This economic reality highlights another dimension of the tragedy. The families who chose institutionalization were not just failing morally, they were making poor economic decisions as well. Community-based care, when it was available, typically cost less than institutional care while providing better outcomes for the individuals involved. The legal framework surrounding guardianship and institutionalization also played a role in these tragedies. In the early to mid-20th century, families had almost unlimited authority to make decisions about disabled relatives. There were few safeguards to protect the rights of people with disabilities, and virtually no mechanisms for them to challenge decisions made on their behalf. This legal framework made it easy for families to institutionalize disabled relatives and forget about them. Once someone was committed to an institution, they essentially lost all legal rights and became completely dependent on their guardians for any decisions about their care or living situation. For the royal children, this meant that they were completely at the mercy of family members who had already demonstrated their willingness to abandon them. The absence of advocacy organizations for people with disabilities during this era also contributed to these tragedies. There were few voices speaking up for the rights of people with intellectual disabilities, few organizations working to improve their conditions, and little public awareness of their potential. This silence allowed institutional abuses to continue unchecked and families to make tragic decisions without facing any meaningful opposition. The gradual emergence of parent advocacy groups in the mid-20th century began to change this dynamic. Parents who refused to institutionalize their disabled children started forming support networks, sharing information, and advocating for better services. These grassroots organizations provided crucial counterpoints to the medical establishment's recommendations for institutionalization. The ARC, originally called the National Association for Retarded Children, was founded in 1950 by parents who refused to accept that their children were hopeless cases. This organization and others like it began to challenge the assumptions that had led to the abandonment of children like the royal cousins. They demonstrated that with appropriate support, people with intellectual disabilities could learn, grow, and contribute to their community. These advocacy organizations also began to document the conditions in institutions, bringing public attention to the often horrific treatment that residents receive. Exposés of institutional abuse became more common in the 1960s and 1970s, gradually shifting public opinion against large-scale institutionalization. The civil rights movement of the 1960s also influenced attitudes toward disability. As society began to recognize the injustice of discrimination based on race, some advocates began to draw parallels to discrimination based on disability. This broader context of social justice helped frame disability issues in terms of rights and equality rather than just charity and medical treatment. The normalization movement, which originated in Scandinavia in the 1960s, provided a theoretical framework for rethinking how people with disabilities should be treated. This movement emphasized that people with disabilities should have access to living conditions and experiences that were as normal as possible. This philosophy was the antithesis of institutional care and provided intellectual justification for community-based alternatives. These social movements created a context in which the hidden stories of royal children with disabilities could be understood as part of broader patterns of discrimination and injustice. When the Bose Leon story emerged in 1987, it was interpreted not just as an isolated family tragedy, but as evidence of systemic problems in how society treated people with disabilities. The media coverage of the story reflected this broader understanding. Journalists didn't just focus on the sensational aspects of royal family members being hidden in institutions. They also explored the broader implications for disability policy and social attitude. This coverage helped educate the public about the history of disability discrimination and the need for continued reform. The story also coincided with important legislative developments in disability rights. The 1980s saw the passage of important laws protecting the rights of people with disabilities, including educational rights and anti-discrimination protections. The revelation about the royal children provided powerful examples of why such protections were needed. The Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in 1990, was influenced in part by stories like those of the hidden royal children. Advocates used these examples to demonstrate the pervasive nature of disability discrimination and the need for comprehensive legal protection. The law's passage marked a turning point in how society viewed the rights of people with disabilities. Similar legislation was adopted in other countries throughout the 1990s and 2000s, creating a global movement toward greater inclusion and protection for people with disabilities. These legal developments would have made it much more difficult for families to simply abandon their disabled relatives to institutional care, as had happened with the royal children. The evolution of special education also played a crucial role in changing outcomes for people with Down syndrome. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act, passed in the United States in 1975, guaranteed that all children with disabilities had the right to a free and appropriate public education. This law and similar legislation in other countries opened up educational opportunities that had previously been denied to children with intellectual disabilities. The royal children who were institutionalized never had access to education in any meaningful sense. Their potential for learning was dismissed from the beginning, and they were never given opportunities to develop academically or intellectually. Modern understanding of Down syndrome recognizes that people with the condition can learn to read, write, and master many academic skills when given appropriate instruction and support. The contrast between what we now know is possible and what the royal children experienced is particularly stark in the area of communication. People with Down syndrome often have speech and language delays, but with appropriate therapy and support, most can develop effective communication skills. Narissa and Catherine likely never received any speech therapy or communication support, leaving them more isolated and dependent than they needed to be. Social skills development was another area where the royal children were failed by institutional care. People with Down syndrome typically have strong social skills and enjoy interacting with others, but these skills need to be nurtured and developed through positive social experience. Institutional settings provided few opportunities for meaningful social interaction, leading to isolation and regression in social development. The lack of vocational training or work opportunities in institutions also limited the development of the royal children. People with Down syndrome can work in a variety of settings when given appropriate training and support, but institutions typically provided no preparation for employment or productive activity. Residents were expected to remain dependent for life, so no effort was made to develop their capabilities. The absence of family relationships was perhaps the most devastating aspect of institutional life for the royal children. People with Down syndrome typically form strong family bonds and benefit enormously from family support and involvement. By cutting off all family contact and pretending the children were dead, their relatives denied them one of the most important sources of emotional support and motivation. This family abandonment also had practical consequences. Family members are often the most effective advocates for people with disabilities, fighting for better services and opportunity. The royal children had no one to advocate for them, no one to challenge poor treatment, and no one to ensure their needs were being met. They were completely vulnerable and dependent on institutional staff who were often overworked and undertrained. The religious and spiritual dimensions of the royal children's experiences also deserve consideration. Many people with Down syndrome have rich spiritual lives and benefit from religious community involvement. The royal children, isolated in institutions, were likely denied these opportunities for spiritual growth and community connection. The broader philosophical questions raised by these stories continue to resonate today. What do we owe to family members who are different or disabled? How do we balance individual needs with family reputation and social expectations? How do we ensure that vulnerable people are protected from abandonment and abuse? These questions are not merely historical curiosities. They remain relevant in contemporary discussions about disability, family responsibility, and social inclusion. While the most extreme forms of institutionalization described in these stories are no longer common, subtler forms of exclusion and discrimination persist. The legacy of the royal children who were hidden away continues to influence disability advocacy and policy development. Their stories serve as powerful reminders of what can happen when people with disabilities are denied their basic human rights and dignity. They provide motivation for continued vigilance in protecting these rights and ensuring that such tragedies never happen again.